Hello, and welcome to another episode of Treasury Talks, where we discuss with thought leaders across the state of Delaware and really across the nation some of the things that are most pressing. And I am so honored today to have Claire DeMatteis with us. Claire currently serves in the governor's office as special assistant to the governor, who's overseeing the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, millions and millions of dollars that have come into the state from the federal government. What a process. Claire, I actually, I'm overwhelmed by your bio and would love it if you could give us a little bit of a background on sort of how you came to this position and some of the other roles that you have served in the state of Delaware.
Well, thank you, Madam Treasurer, and I really appreciate you inviting me to do this. You and I have worked really closely together on these American Rescue Plan funds and really appreciate the cooperation of your staff. You've been great to work with. For my friends in Kent and Sussex County, my career started at WBOC TV as a television reporter. Best job I've ever had. I was going to law school at nights. And when I graduated, I joined Governor Mike Castle for a year in his final year as governor, as his deputy assistant legal counsel was my title. And got to work on some really great projects, like the first state to have universal access to healthcare for all children in our state. It was a partnership between the state and the Moores. And from there, I worked for then Senator Biden for 10 years as his senior counsel. And again, got to work on some really impactful projects, like implementing the Violence Against Women Act and the crime law, and just a great 10 years with him. And from there, I went in to a law firm as a partner. It's a large Mid-Atlantic law firm, and I was head of the Delaware office. And from there, I went in-house as general counsel. And that's significant to this assignment because one of my responsibilities, a big responsibility, was compliance. And that factors into this assignment very heavily, and perhaps not intuitively to the public, but for the governor, for me, for you, for our teams, making sure these funds are spent how we've directed them to be spent, make sure they're spent on budget and on time is going to be really critical over the next several years. And so I'm really proud to bring that background to this. When Governor Carney was elected, he asked me to join his administration. And he said at the time that I would help out in several agencies. And he's been true to his word on that. First started at Department of Labor and helped with some issues there, including the state's largest data breach at the time. And then we had the very horrific riot and murder at the state's largest prison. And he asked me to work with the Department of Correction team to implement more than 40 reforms that were identified that potentially caused the riot and the murder. And within a year, we did that. And the then commissioner retired, and head of the correctional union, officers union, and the governor convinced me to take on the role of commissioner of that department, and still miss the people, and left a great team in place and went on to be special assistant for these American Rescue Plan funds. I have another new assignment coming up, but for right now, I am focused on working with you and your team and the governor and our local towns and our state agencies and our nonprofits on these American Rescue Plan funds.
When you look back at all of the talents that you employed in each and every position that you held, it's very impressive. And again, your dedication to the state of Delaware, particularly most recent, the American Rescue Plan Act, how that funding sort of came to become available. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what a summary of what that looked like and how we received those dollars?
First, it was the CARES Act funding, coronavirus relief funding. The state received about $1 billion in that funding, and that 90+% of that went to small businesses, to nonprofits, to child care centers, really helped hospitals as well. And, as you recall, that was, the real heart of the virus before the vaccines, when, a lot of us just felt helpless. And then after that, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan Act, and Delaware received for a state $925 million. Your office was in charge of distributing it to our local towns and our local cities, and they got another $335 million approximately. And again, our offices, the governor's office and your office, has worked closely to help those those local cities and towns with compliance and making sure they're spending that money on projects that are in fact eligible. Delaware has $925 million to spend on the state fiscal recovery funds, and we have an additional $112 million to spend on solely capital fund projects. The governor has issued an application and they were due last December, and the majority of those funds are going to go towards libraries and towards capital projects for nonprofits in our communities that are doing such impactful work. But every project, as you well know, every project that the governor wants to approve has to go through a very extensive review process. Those projects come to us from legislators, from community groups, from mayors, from nonprofits, and we go through it and look at eligibility. And unlike any federal program, Colleen, that I've been involved with for over 30 years, this is the most strict in terms of eligibility rules and in terms of compliance rules. Every project has to be related to the pandemic. It has to meet the pandemic need, and it has to impact systemic public health, public safety, and economic downturn issues. It also has to help communities hardest hit. For the actual capital fund projects, those that are buildings, helping to support nonprofits with additional space, for example, they have to meet even more strict requirements. All of those projects, the U.S. Treasury has to demonstrate to them that they meet education, work, and health monitoring. So very, very rigorous standards. I'm glad they're rigorous. The federal government needs to hold state and local governments and nonprofits to a very high standard with these funds. And our review process demonstrates just how serious we take that responsibility. The final piece of it is, even if the governor says this is something we want to do, Department of Justice has to issue a written compliance opinion that we then can take to the auditors. Even with all that, any non-state agency that receives funds has to sign an agreement, and they're agreeing to use the funds as they've said that the need exists. We have audit rights. We will bring every single state agency, every single nonprofit in on a quarterly basis, at least, to review how they're doing with the project. So this isn't just award the money, good luck, see you later, hope it works out. This is a very intense, very rigorous, very compliant focused program, and it'll be with us now for the next at least 3 years.
You mentioned before that, it's nice to have that rigorous process because you've got some hard guardrails that sort of tell us how we can, spend these funds, or how the governor's office can spend these funds. I'm curious, because those guardrails are super and they're great to have. And I understand that the reason that those guardrails were put in place in passing the American Rescue Plan Act was really to get that bipartisanship. And I'm wondering if you, at the same time that you're going through this rigorous process, which is daunting in and of itself, are you also experiencing some political pressure, maybe from legislators or other folks that, that are sort of weighing in on some of this process? And how are you dealing with that?
It's a fair question. Sure. Legislators, groups that are politically affiliated have their ideas of how to spend some of these funds. I think it actually helps that the federal government has been so out front and so specific on what we can and cannot spend these funds on. If somebody has a special project and They're very rigorous in their advocacy for it. Once I show them, this is what we have to report in writing, they understand that if it's just not eligible, it's just not eligible. Sure, it's tough to say no. I think, and I've heard this from a legislator or two, I think it helps actually that they know me, they know my reputation as being fair. They know that, I understand the compliance piece of this, that I have the federal experience as well. That I used to work for the man who, is our president, and Delaware's not going to do anything to embarrass him ever on this project. And so they're very rational about that, and they understand that.
Well, and I think that kind of brings up another point that I would love if you would talk about in having a lot of these conversations with folks across the state, particularly among our local governments. We get a lot of questions about, well, how are you sort of involved in the audit process? What does that actually look like? What's U.S. Treasury's involvement? And how do we know that these funds are being spent properly? Those types of things. So how can you kind of speak to that?
And I'm going to credit you and your staff on that one. You really pushed me in the right direction on this. We made sure that we got all the local cities and towns, almost all of them. I think maybe there was a handful that didn't participate. And they have one law firm that reviews all of their projects. The law firm's on a monthly retainer basis. It is allowed to come out of their federal funds. So it's not like it's coming out of the town funds or something. It's coming out of the federal funds. And any project that a local city or town wants to do, just like the state, they get a written opinion, a written legal compliance opinion that it's eligible. And so when we do go through our annual audit, and all these projects will be audited, when we go through that audit, those auditors will see this compliance opinion from an attorney. And that gives the auditors assurance that we did our due diligence and that we are holding ourselves accountable, that these projects are being spent on to meet the eligibility requirements of the federal rules. I have to repeat that often to some folks. These aren't my rules. These aren't the governor's rules. These aren't the state treasurer's rules. These are the federal rules that we have to comply with.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I would say that for a lot of towns, they're looking at their priorities and how their priorities can sort of align with the federal rules, right? In that regard, how would you say or could you sort of highlight some of the governor's priorities and how that spending looks on the state level? It's
a really easy way to talk about these funds. Some people think, oh, $1 billion fund, what are we going to do? Let's put in perspective. Our state budget's just shy of $5 billion. So it's a fifth of our state budget. The governor, the General Assembly have expressed priorities that they've already been working on the past 4 years. So we're using these funds to further those priorities, investing in our children, investing in education, investing in our communities, making our neighborhoods safer, investing in housing. We've got some catching up to do for housing projects up and down our state. And that's where we're focusing these dollars. The first thing I did was reached out to all the state agencies on guidance from the governor to say, what are your one-time projects that you have known for the past 20 years that this state needs? And we've just never had this infusion of cash to fund it. And that was where we started. And, we saw the pent-up demand. For example, 90-year-old Delaware Hospital for the Chronically Ill in Smyrna, 90 years old. Yeah. During a pandemic with COVID, there are patients that were positive in the same room, sharing the same bathroom because there was no other bathroom with patients who were COVID negative. You can't have that in a pandemic. Mm-hmm. We've known as a state, we needed to replace this hospital for decades. And now we have the money to do it. And it was one of the first projects we got approved. That's going to help generations to come. And it's where we should be spending these dollars. Everything has to be pandemic related. Whether this pandemic now goes on for another year or 2 years, and for the next governor in 10 or 20 or 100 years to be prepared for the next infectious disease. That's what all these projects are focused on.
I love that point because, you're talking about long-term sustainability, a long-term focus. And, it's one of those things where you think back to the 2013 and sort of even like in 2009, when we were dealing with swine flu and H1N1 and things like that, it was a real study of some of our care facilities, particularly long-term care, where we said, are people properly being isolated and things like that? And so that's only one part of it. The other part is keeping our child care facilities open. That keeps people at work and functional. And so you are talking about sort of, promoting those parts of our economy that help us all to maintain an economy and sort of maintain the health of our population.
And we have a focus on transparency for all these projects as well. Delaware.gov/rescue plan. We list all the projects that have been funded. We'll keep that up to date. We update it at least monthly, sometimes more frequently. And that's just the money that the state received. There is money that Department of Education receives separately. And if you go to any of the school districts' websites, you can see how they spent their funds. A lot of the schools spent money to upgrade HVAC systems, to improve the air ventilation systems for kids, which is really important. But there's a lot of transparency around this. We don't want guessing games of how this money is being spent. We're promoting it, we're getting out there, and anybody can go to the Delaware.gov/rescue plan to see how it's been spent to date.
The final rule just came out a few days ago. I'm wondering if sort of I know you have had so many requests and you've been sort of fast paced, really looking at these in depth, a lot of these requests. Do you have any remaining requests or anything that's sort of a curveball, or does the final rule cause you any challenges? Can you give us any like last minute, maybe little tidbits about what it's like to stand in your shoes for a moment?
The final rule did throw us a little bit of a curveball. They tightened the rules about how you can use this money to support projects caused by the economic downturn. Mm. And I think there was some concern that everybody was justifying this. Other states were justifying projects because of the economic downturn. And so they tightened those rules. So we are going back and taking a look at how we approve some remaining projects in the pipeline if they're based on an economic downturn. And the other thing that I'll mention there, Colleen, is that we're not out of this pandemic. We just saw with the Delta variant and Omicron, is there another variant coming down the pipe? We have to reserve some funds, and the governor has been very clear with this. We have to reserve some funds because we may be in this for another year or two, God forbid. But we want to be prepared. We want to have the money for the testing and for the vaccination clinics and for the supplies for our state agencies. So we are being very prudent with understanding that while the federal government wants us to get this money out the door and into the hands of community groups and state agencies and really boost the economy and create jobs, and we're doing that. But we're also being cautious to say, let's see where these variants take us over the next 6 or 8 months.
I really appreciate you taking the time to stop for a moment and describe your day and the complexities of it, and really appreciate all the work and collaboration that we've been able to participate in along with you.
Absolutely appreciate all the coordination with your office. It's been a pleasure.